Welcome to CardioBuzz and to our series on pulmonary embolism, where we review the diagnosis and management of acute pulmonary embolism based on the latest ACC/AHA guidelines. In the previous episode, we have discussed the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism, which is based on three pillars: the clinical probability, the biomarkers, and the imaging. We've also dedicated an entire episode to the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism in pregnancy. In this episode, we will focus on the risk stratification, and we will see how this risk stratification will help us choose the disposition of the patient and the intensity of therapy. So the mortality and the morbidity of pulmonary embolism is critically determined in the first 30 days. And the average mortality is between 7% and 11%. But this range is very misleading. The mortality of pulmonary embolism can range between less than 1% to more than 30%. So we have a wide range of probabilities when it comes to the 30 days risk. And the mortality in the first 30 days is mostly determined by acute right ventricular failure. And pulmonary embolism is not a transient episode in the life of the patient. There is a chance of recurrences, and there is a late surge of mortality that can be seen months or years after the pulmonary embolism. 50% of the patients will report persistent functional impairment 6 months after the event, and there's a 25% chance of recurrence for unprovoked pulmonary embolism without anticoagulation, and 2 to 4% will develop chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. So the acute phase is marked by the occlusive thrombus in the pulmonary arteries. Then there is a risk of recurrence in patients who do not resolve their thrombi completely, and there is a later phase where patients develop increased pulmonary vascular resistance and right-sided heart failure secondary to chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. And we need to note that death by pulmonary embolism is different from death with pulmonary embolism. Death by pulmonary embolism, where the embolus is the primary driver of mortality, whereas we see patients with pulmonary embolism where the primary driver is the underlying condition, which could be the chronic heart disease, the chronic lung disease, or most importantly, the malignant conditions. So the 30-day mortality in cancer-associated PE is often driven by the malignancy, not by the embolus itself. And so in the old days, we used to stratify pulmonary embolism into a massive pulmonary embolism, which was defined by hypotension or obstructive shock, where the mortality is more than 30%, or an intermediate risk submassive, where the mortality is between 5 and 15%, where the main driver of morbidity and mortality is right ventricular dysfunction, clinical deterioration, and arrhythmia. And we had low risk pulmonary embolism. The mortality is less than 1%, where the primary driver of mortality would be bleeding and the comorbidities. But in the recent guidelines, this classification of massive versus submassive is obsolete. Even the classification by the European Society of Cardiology in 2018 is now obsolete. They used to stratify patients into low risk, high risk, and intermediate, intermediate high, intermediate low. Now the guidelines are moving into a more intricate and sophisticated staging or categories of pulmonary embolism, from A until E, where the mortality is increasing, and for every clinical category there are subcategories, and there are also respiratory modifiers. And I know it looks complicated and challenging to memorize, so I will try to simplify it so that we can remember it and apply it in our everyday practice. And you shouldn't be surprised that we're having these complex gradings, because we've already seen that in the SKY staging of cardiogenic shock, where again we have 5 stages from A to E with increasing mortality as we go up the pyramid. So we'll try to simplify these 5 categories from A until E. So A is asymptomatic pulmonary embolism. For example, the embolus which is discovered incidentally in a patient who's doing chest imaging for another reason. For example, a patient with bronchial cancer who's doing a follow-up, who's doing a regular CT, and they discover a pulmonary embolus. B is benign. So B is symptomatic but benign. Remember, B for benign. This is low-risk pulmonary embolism. C is symptomatic and serious. They have markers of elevated risk. D, of course, is symptomatic and dangerous. Remember, D for dangerous, where patients have incipient cardiopulmonary failure. E is extreme, where patients have manifest cardiopulmonary failure with an extremely high risk of morbidity and mortality. And for every category, we can add the letter R. The R is the respiratory modifier, which means that the primary presentation and the primary pathology is respiratory, because the patient is either tachypnic, has desaturation, or requires ventilatory support. But how do we reach to these 5 categories of risk? We collect elements from the history, from the physical examination, from the laboratory evaluation and from the imaging, and then we incorporate them into clinical scores, and these clinical scores would move us between the categories from A until E. So if we look at the history, advanced age is a risk factor, male gender is a poor prognostic factor, chronic lung disease, chronic heart disease, and of course cancer. These are all markers of high risk. Physical examination, mental obtundation, desaturation, hypotension, tachycardia, diminished cardiac output. Looking at the labs, elevation of troponin, elevation of proBNP, and elevation of lactate. We'll discuss these shortly. And in the imaging, we look at the echo to assess RV function and hemodynamics. We can also derive some information from the CT scan, looking at the RV to LV ratio, the reflux of contrast into the inferior vena cava. And it can be clear in some situations that the risk is extreme. Patients after a cardiac arrest, or patients with hypotension, with obstructive shock, multi-organ failure. If we need just one marker to guide us about the risk, then it's going to be the systolic blood pressure or the mean blood pressure. A mean blood pressure above 80 is a marker of excellent prognosis, and below 80 is a marker of poor prognosis. Hypotension can be transient and it can be persistent, lasting for more than 15 minutes. It can be defined by an absolute value of less than 90 millimeters mercury, or by just a decline from the baseline blood pressure of more than or equal 40 millimeters of mercury. And even when the patient is not hypotensive, we can get some markers of poor tissue perfusion. We call this normotensive shock. And we can characterize that by a rising serum lactate, which means that the body is shifting towards anaerobic metabolism, or by decreasing urine output, or by a significant rise in serum creatinine, indicating an acute kidney injury, or if we have the Swan-Ganz catheter, by a decline in the cardiac index. So in these three situations, the patient has apparently a stable or holding blood pressure, whereas in fact, there is tissue hypoperfusion evidenced by diminished cardiac index, increasing serum lactate, or renal hypoperfusion. So we've looked into the clinical markers. The biomarkers are also very useful. A rise of troponin indicates microinfarctions in the right ventricle and acute pressure overload, and it portends a 4 times increased risk of mortality. The same applies to elevation of proBNP, that signifies myocardial stretch, again portends a 6-fold odds of increased short-term mortality. We just mentioned elevation of serum lactate or failure of lactate clearance. It correlates strongly with early mortality. Clinical, laboratory, and imaging. RV dilatation is a marker of increased short-term risk. We take the ratio of the RV to the LV. It's an independent predictor of death. Echocardiography has an advantage over CT pulmonary angiography because it can give us multiple parameters to assess the RV dimensions and contractility. And one important caveat is that the thrombus burden should not be taken as a marker of risk. We see patients with a large thrombus burden, but they have stable hemodynamics. And we can also see patients with a small thrombus burden, but they develop RV failure and elevated biomarkers. So the quantification of the angiographic thrombus volume is not recommended for short-term risk stratification. We stratify patients based on how the cardiopulmonary system responds, not just to the mere size of the clot. And so we collect these elements from the history, the physical examination, the labs, and the imaging, and we incorporate them into objective measures of risk. The clinical calculators are important in at least 2 decisions. Who can be managed at home and who requires hospital admission? And from those who require hospital admission, who is more likely to deteriorate? So they have to be admitted to the ICU, and who are less likely to deteriorate so they can be managed in a regular ward. So we have at least 5 scores. The PESI, the simplified PESI, the Hestia, the Bova, and the News too. And of course, we're not supposed to recite and recall all of these scores. We need to rely on a portable device, a smartphone or a tablet, or the electronic medical record can sometimes be helpful in calculating these clinical scores. So let's take them one by one and we'll go through them quickly. The PESI score is the oldest one. It's based only on clinical variables, 11 variables. Each variable is given a different weight. And so patients who score more than 125, they have a very high 30-day mortality, where patients with a score less than 65 have an extremely low 30-day mortality. And because it's cumbersome to look into 11 clinical variables, we got the simplified PESI score, which looks only into 6 variables. Each variable is assigned 1 point, and they are all clinical variables. They don't look into the echo or into the biomarkers. And the nice thing about this simplified PESI, that it can tell us who can be managed at home and who needs hospital admission. So in those patients who have a 0 PESI score, these are low risk and they can be managed on outpatient basis just on oral anticoagulants. Whereas those patients with one or more risk criterion, they must be hospitalized. We have another similar score called the Hestia score, a Greek goddess. It looks into medical and also psychosocial variables, looks into hemodynamic variables, the need for thrombolysis, the intensity of the pain, desaturation, liver impairment, renal impairment, the risk of bleeding. Pregnancy is an important marker of risk, the presence of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, the lack of home support, and the presence of cancer or an active infection. In patients who tick negative for all of the 11 criteria, they can be discharged early or even managed at home. But if we tick any of these variables, then the patient needs to be admitted. And in those patients who have no markers of risk, we classify them as B, benign, whereas patients with any of these risk markers would be category C, serious or higher. So the PESI, the simplified PESI, and the Hestia score help us to decide who will be managed at home and who needs hospital admission. But in those patients who are admitted to the hospital, who are normotensive and hemodynamically stable, we have two other scoring systems that will help us predict clinical deterioration in admitted patients. So we decide who should be monitored in an ICU and who can be managed in a regular ward. So the Bova score looks into 4 variables: blood pressure and heart rate, cardiac troponin, and RV dysfunction, usually echo. Hypotension takes 2 points, elevation of cardiac troponin takes 2 points, RV dysfunction 2 points, tachycardia more than 110 takes 1 point, and the total score is 7. For those patients who score more than 4, that's a highest risk. Less than 2 or less is the lowest risk, and in between is moderate risk. Patients with a score less than 4 will go into the benign category, category B, whereas patients who score more than 4, they will go into the serious or category C. We have another score to predict deterioration in the hospital. It's called the NEWS-2. It also looks into clinical variables: the blood pressure, the heart rate, the oxygen saturation, the respiratory rate, the level of consciousness. And a score more than 9 denotes a high-risk patient. The nice thing about the NEWS score is that it gives us the advantage of longitudinal tracking. We can do it daily, and if we see a rise above 9 points, it means that this patient is deteriorating and may be a candidate for advanced and aggressive therapies of pulmonary embolism. And so we look into variables from the history, the physical examination, the biomarkers, and the imaging. We incorporate them into the scores, the PESI and the Hestia, help us to decide outpatient treatment versus admission. And for those who are admitted, you can choose either the Bova or the NEWS to predict who will deteriorate, so he goes to the ICU, and who is less likely to deteriorate and can be managed in the general ward. And I know it's intimidating to look into all of these scores and try to learn them by heart. Maybe in the future we all have chips that can easily calculate these risk scores just by looking into the patient's chart, where doctors will evolve into cyborgs. So to revise, we have 5 clinical categories. A is asymptomatic, incidentally discovered pulmonary embolism. B is benign pulmonary embolism, and it can be distal, B1, or proximal, which is B2. We have C, which is symptomatic and serious pulmonary embolism. We have from C1 until C3. C1, where the RV and the biomarkers are normal. C2, where either the RV is abnormal or the biomarkers are abnormal. C3, both the RV and the biomarkers are abnormal. And the respiratory modifier is desaturation less than 90% or a respiratory rate more than 30 with a need for supplemental oxygen. D is dangerous pulmonary embolism, where there is transient hypotension or normotensive shock, where we have a rise in the serum lactate, renal hypoperfusion, or reduced cardiac index. And the respiratory modifier for the D is the need for more than 6 liters of oxygen or the use of a non-rebreathing mask. E is the extreme, where we have clear cardiopulmonary failure. This is the highest risk, of course. Mortality more than 30%. E1 is recurrent or persistent hypotension with cardiogenic shock. E2 is refractory shock or cardiac arrest. And the respiratory modifier here is hypoxemic respiratory failure or ventilatory failure. We use these categories to decide on the short-term risk and the long-term risk. Patients with category A are managed on outpatient basis. The benign ones can be admitted and early discharged. Any of the markers of risk would put the patient in the stage C or higher. These need to be hospitalized. And in these patients, we use the Bova or the NEWS score to decide who is likely to deteriorate and should be managed in the ICU. Stage D and E are high-risk stages where patients need to be admitted to the ICU and may be candidates for advanced therapies, thrombolysis, or catheter-directed therapies. So that was all for risk stratification. Thank you for watching this episode, and stay tuned for the next episode where we will start discussing the therapies of pulmonary embolism, oral anticoagulation, parenteral anticoagulation, thrombolytic therapy, hemodynamic approaches, and catheter-directed thrombolysis. See you in the next episode.